welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimes.
And I'm Brian Rohenbacher.
And we have an exciting show for you today, as usual.
We hear from philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples, chemical engineer Barrie Winn, and astronomer Hugh Ross.
They're going to discuss whether human consciousness emerges from the brain, whether ice ages point to God, and because it's almost Earth Day, how we can care for creation.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra will chat with Stuart McAlister of RZIM on why we don't have to outgrow Christianity. Let's check that out.
Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we discuss culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with RZIM Stuart McAlister. Thank you so much for joining us.
Love it. Thank you.
I'm excited to talk with you about a topic that you're actually writing a book about with your son, Cameron McAlister, who, by the way, was on the show.
Right.
He was wonderful. The topic of the book is You Don't Have to Outgrow Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So what led you to write that book?
Well, over the years, as we've been speaking individually, we get a lot of parents come to conferences and come with questions, say, well, my child went to Sunday school, went to the church, and then at a certain point, either in high school or somewhere along the way, just gave up and lost their faith or got angry and walked away, and the parents were confused. So really born out of questions that were really places of deep pain and confusion for many people.
Yeah. So what would you say then are some of the biggest obstacles in those issues of pain that are leading people to feel like they're outgrowing their faith?
Well, there was a common thread that came through in many of these kids to us. We saw that they didn't have question-friendly homes. In other words, they had real issues, maybe spiritual, maybe apologetic, maybe something about the Bible, and sometimes simple, not necessarily profound. And they would ask one of the parents, and it would be batted off, or we just believe. And then they would try the same in church, and the same would happen. So for many, that then pushed them towards skepticism, or just say, well, there's nothing in this. And then when they find a tribe who also doesn't believe, they were very easily coaxed away into another vision.
Right. Well, and that's a wonderful reminder then about creating then a question-friendly environment, either in the home, well, both in the home and in
church, both.
In
Yeah,
church.
absolutely.
How would one go about doing that?
Well, I think it's when you have to think of the teaching moments at home. Every mother, every father knows this. They're just those moments that come up. And really, the Proverbs and a lot of Scripture was written this way. So it's when the moment comes up, you don't let it pass.
Right.
Even if you don't know a big answer, you give some kind of answer and you start a conversation. And that had, we talked with our kids about sex. We talked about the book of Revelation. We talked about all sometimes putting them to bed at night when they started the question.
Yeah.
And it would be easy to bat it off. But I think the thing was to be prepared as an adult, as a parent, to take responsibility.
Right. And you know what, I think that's wonderful, especially like the bedtime routine. It seems like in the bedtime routine, or even like driving in the car, that's
Meal
kind
tables.
of
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
where kids open up
Totally.
and they have questions. One of the things as a parent that I've kind of modeled for my kids is being able to kind of have those questions and grapple with those questions with them, and they get to see me do that. What are some ways that if someone, especially a parent who wants to model that for their children, how can they kind of wrestle with questions in a healthy way to model the same for their kids?
Well, part of it's being willing to be a learner, not feeling you have to be an expert. Because the fact is, you're going to have to say sometimes to the kids, I don't know, but I'll find out. You're going to have to read, you have to be able to go after it. And they don't have to be super in depth. But sometimes what the parents use is they dump lots of information, or they try to use fear, or the third thing they often do is try and outsource their kids to some expert group, some, Awana or Youth for Christ or something. And I'm not saying don't use those are great, but it's not, it's a supplement, it's not a replacement of the role of being involved yourself. And that means learning to do the hard work. And it doesn't need to be you become a theologian.
Right.
Just read your Bible and think through. And there are websites, there are materials available, RTB, RZI, and many other organizations that will help give you tools if you need some research.
So what are some of the biggest obstacles that you have seen people struggle with, and then what have they done to help kind of find those answers?
Well, I think the biggest obstacles are often where there is a child who's an intellectual, not everyone is, or more needs answers, but they're not being treated that way. And so they're not being heard. The number one issue is listening and trying to understand. Seek first to understand, then to be understood, right? So showing understanding, and even if you can't get it, showing that you're willing to find that this is important enough. We're putting value on their question and trying to journey with them through it. I think a lack of love, a lack of sincerity, maybe mocking it or just blinding it, is where some of the negative stuff does, because it's not showing love.
Right.
And again, we want our kids, we want our people to feel secure, to feel loved, but also to feel informed and intelligent. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Your faith can go out with boots on.
Right.
Tackles the real world.
Right. No, definitely. And I think that being willing to say, I don't know, but coming back, I think that there's such power in being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I don't know, but let me find out. And I'll come back.
And be serious about the questions. Be serious about that it's a real ask. It's not just somebody push off into the background.
So can you share some practical tips then for parents or for young people who are in that space of either working with a loved one and helping them not outgrow their faith, or they might feel challenged to the point of possibly outgrowing their faith?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd say is give it time and take time. So don't get impatient and don't rush, because you need to let the person talk and go at their pace. Yeah. The second thing is do your homework. And look for resources. If you don't know, 5 minutes on the internet, you can come up with, books, articles, materials, or someone to call who can point you to the kind of materials or stuff. But the third part then is actually having those conversations and not avoiding them, and inviting the person on a journey. Said, let's do this together. I'm with you. This is a murky area. I don't need the answer. How about we journey together? We'll give it a little bit of time every week or every few days. That way it shows that you're serious, that we're interested, that we care, and it puts a bodily expression into ideas, not just concepts that are, for your imagination type of thing.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That is a wonderful reminder, because yes, it is hard work and we want to keep at it. Just like a diet, we want to keep at this
discipline,
kind of change.
focus.
Yeah, definitely. So thank you again for that.
My pleasure.
If you'd like to hear more from Stuart McAlister, go to RZIM.org. Now we're going to head to our Nexus segment. We will hear from Barrie Winn, and he will talk about caring for creation. Let's check it out.
As somebody who's worked in industry, and also as a Christian, what is your view on environmentalism?
Well, I think it's a very important part. In fact, I don't think you can work in the chemical industry without being an environmental person. As you think about ensuring that what you're doing, you're creating resources, using resources, but you don't want to damage other resources. For example, when you are mining phosphate, you don't want to damage associated waterways or the air. So you want to be a good steward of other resources while taking the resource of phosphate and turning it into resources needed for human flourishing. One of the experiences I had working in a very large complex with phosphate is trying to work with two other groups, regulators and environmental interest groups, to come up with a plan to reduce phosphorus discharges to waterways. And that was an interesting experience because there was no trust between those different groups. But I found from experience you could get down and work together. We were able to come up with a solution that everybody could buy into and we could implement, and it was very successful. And so often the polarization over environmental affairs, if we can replace it with cooperation, if you will, working together to come up with solutions, you can make progress and improve our stewardship of the environment.
Do you feel that your faith as a Christian motivated you in those kind of projects, maybe in a way that someone who wasn't a Christian might be motivated?
Well, I think that to a certain extent, my faith made me want to do my job well. And also, I wanted to treat the people I worked with, even if we were somewhat adversaries, to treat them with respect. And so working together with people that could potentially be seen as adversaries, we can cooperate, work together, come up with solutions. And I think, and of course, this was a very large project, and I was just one person in that project. I had a pretty important role as senior environmental engineer, but there were a lot of other people, and like even my supervisor would share my convictions. And so I think having a Christian perspective certainly helped. I mean, it was a lot of people involved, but
Now, where does this idea that Christians don't care about the environment come from?
that's a very good question. And you have to go back about 50 years. A historian, Lynn White, published a very provocative paper entitled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And his thesis was that so modern science came out of a Christian worldview, which is true, but another part of that Christian worldview is we are to have dominion over the creation and therefore use it for our own benefit and not worry about the consequences. Well, that is not a correct view of Christian stewardship of the environment. And fortunately, Francis Schaeffer, a great Christian thinker, wrote a response to that entitled Pollution and the Death of Man, which is, I'd say, recommended reading for any Christian who's thinking about environmental issues. And he makes the point that, yes, we are given dominion, but it's not dominion as rulers, it's dominion as stewards. We've been given the responsibility by God to take care of the earth and all of the life on it. And so we should be seen as taking the lead in being good stewards of the environment and of the resources on the earth.
If you'd like to hear more from Dr. Barrie Winn, please visit the Reasons to Believe YouTube channel. Now it's time for RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to help you share your faith more effectively. And I'm here once again with philosopher and theologian Kenneth Samples. Welcome back, Ken.
Hello.
And today we're going to be talking about a very important question, and that is kind of the relationship between the brain and the mind.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure many of us have really reflected deeply on the differences between those two things. Sometimes we tend to even use them interchangeably.
Yeah.
So maybe you can start us off with kind of some definitions of how
Sure.
are those things different or similar?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, Krista, that in science, so you have neuroscience, scientists are interested in the question of consciousness, philosophers are interested in the question, even theologians want to weigh in. I think what's interesting, of course, is that the brain is extended in space. You can weigh it, you can measure it, you could cut a hole in the skull and see it, touch it. But you can't do those things with the mind. The mind is not extended in space. It's not physical. It's not material. And so understanding what consciousness is, how it relates to the brain, some people would talk about the hard problem of consciousness. But Christianity has, I think, a unique perspective on it, at least historically speaking.
So when we're thinking about consciousness, is that sort of a result of the brain and the mind working together? Is that what we're calling consciousness?
So when we think about the life of thought, we think about consciousness in a broad sense, involving both the mind and the brain. We have things like thoughts and reflections, sensations. We have what philosophers call aboutness. Like right now, I can think about something that doesn't even exist, or I can think about something that happened in the past. Christians typically think, in terms of a dualism, that human beings are a unity of the body and the soul. And so that consciousness, that mind would be a component of the soul. And we can distinguish between the mind and the brain, but they're in union together. And, Thomas Aquinas, the great Catholic philosopher, he said that while our consciousness and our soulishness can exist apart from the body, we're always intended to be an entangled unity. So we can distinguish between mind and brain, but they go together.
Well, that's a very important point, because we don't want to bifurcate the two necessarily, but I think that consciousness has this, like you said, this immaterial component to it, that of
non-physical,
self-awareness and
feelings, thoughts.
Yeah. So when we talk about our mind, tell us more about what Scripture has to say about the mind and its relationship to the body.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is I think that the Bible basically teaches a mind-body dualism. Now, not in a Cartesian sense, but I think that what we see, for example, is that when human beings are created, they're the dust of the ground and the breath of life. Paul in Romans 12 talks about having your mind being renewed and reflection. So I think that the Bible does speak. Now, sometimes people look at passages like love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and they want to cut us up into parts. I think that's really kind of a parallelism, kind of a Hebraic passing through the Greek. I think what Scripture teaches is there is a physical part of us and a non-physical, a material part of us and an immaterial part of us.
And God wants all the parts of us to serve and love him.
With our entire being.
Yeah.
Yes.
Now, if I talk to my non-Christian friend, are they going to think about consciousness and the brain and the mind in the same way as you've outlined here?
Well, I think where we will all agree, even with our secular science-oriented friends, that consciousness is difficult to describe, it's difficult to account for. But they're going to look at it very differently. Soulishness or spirit is something that's foreign to them because, after all, they're physicalists, they're naturalists, materialists. I think that they would say, just generally speaking, that maybe the brain reached a complex level of evolution and then the mind emerged. So a mind is an emergent property of the brain. Or in the old days, we would say if we reduce everything down, we can reduce everything to chemistry, physics, and biology. I don't think any of those views are adequate. And some of the leading neuroscience people, philosophers of mind, I think they've all said that one of the deep challenges of their worldview is trying to account for and explain consciousness.
So going back to your earlier statement about the brain, you can even cut it open and you look at the parts. If I cut it open, can I look at my thoughts? Can I look at me doing a math problem or my emotions or my love for my children? How do I account for this?
Yeah, the brain is the most complex mechanism in the known universe. I remember when I had a brain illness, one of the MRI techs let me see my brain. My first thought was I thought it would be bigger, but you're exactly right. Consciousness involves all of these abstract abilities that we have, and trying to reduce those or explain them in terms of pure physics, chemistry, and biology, I just don't think works.
Comes a little short of explanatory power.
And many secularists would admit such.
Very good. Well, thanks, Ken. And I want to encourage you, if you haven't yet done so, to check out Ken's blog. Just go to reasons.org and search for Reflections. Now we're going over to Jeff. He's talking to Hugh Ross about the question, do ice ages point to God? Let's check it out.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome to Give and Take, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today, we're joined by Reasons to Believe's founder and president, Dr. Hugh Ross, and we're going to be discussing how ice ages affect human civilization. Hugh, good to have you on the show today.
Well, thank you.
So kind of just give us a little bit of an overview. What are ice ages? How do they look like? What are their basic features? Just help us to understand ice ages a little bit.
Well, we're talking about an ice age cycle. I mean, for the last 2.5 million years, we've always had ice.
Okay.
But the ice cycles from about 10% coverage of planet Earth to about 20 to 23% coverage.
Okay, so presumably, we got ice at the poles, and during the 20% coverage, it grows and covers more of the surface of the Earth?
Yeah, most of North America, a lot of Northern Europe and Siberia.
So presumably the temperature of the planet varies fairly significantly during there.
Right.
Roughly what sort of temperature variations do we see in that?
Well, it's about anywhere from 12 to 15 degrees. I mean, about 12 degrees centigrade.
The coldest to the hottest?
Right, but it does vary a lot in between.
Does vary a lot in there. Okay. So something happened about 800,000 years ago that affected this ice age cycle that I know you think is pretty important.
Well, what happened is that it transitioned from being a 41,000 year cycle, driven by the variation of tilt of Earth's orbit or orbital axis, to about a 100,000 year cycle.
Okay, so we would go from ice age, interglacial ice age in 41,000 years, and that shifted now out to about 100,000 years.
Right,
is what
so
you're saying.
The cycle got lengthened from a 41,000 year periodicity to about 100,000 years.
And why is that important?
Well, it's important because it'll actually give you a longer period for an interglacial.
Interglacial being?
The warm period, when you
Okay.
only got 10% coverage.
Okay.
And with a 41,000 year periodicity, you're looking at a warm interglacial that lasts maybe just 3,000 years.
Okay.
Whereas if you got a 41,000, or pardon me, 100,000 year periodicity, it can last 10,000 years. And if it lasts 10,000 years, that gives you time to launch and sustain global high technology civilization.
So it seems like there may be two effects going on in there. One is that the period between the ice ages gets longer, and it's kind of remarkable. We spend most of the time in the ice age. There's a very little time in between the ice ages. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's 90,000 years where you got 20% coverage, and only 10,000 years where you got 10% coverage. So most of the time you're in what's called the glacial. You only have brief times in the interglacial.
So you got a longer period in the interglacial, and presumably a longer period will also bring more stability of temperature within the interglacial, or is that not true?
Necessarily.
Not necessarily.
I mean, the last 8 cycles have been 100,000 year cycles.
Okay.
It's only this one where we've had climate stability in an interglacial.
And so what would climate stability look like? How would you characterize that compared to the previous interglacials?
Well, what you see throughout the ice age cycle is the global mean temperature jumping up and down by about 10 degrees centigrade, 18 degrees Fahrenheit on timescales of several centuries.
Okay.
Which basically makes it impossible to launch large-scale agricultural activity.
Okay.
Which is going to limit civilization.
Right.
What has happened in the last 9,500 years is we've had climate that's been stable to plus or minus 0.65 degrees centigrade. And it's that extreme and long-lasting climate stability that has enabled us to build a large human population and to have global high-technology civilization.
So I'm presuming there's not just one thing that causes this, or would be fairly easy to explain. What are some of the factors that go into explaining this? Because it seems like it's pretty important for humanity to have made this transition.
Well, Jeff, there's been a long debate in the scientific literature over what caused this transition. And I've written about this in several blog articles. It's going to be in my book, Weathering Climate Change. I'm convinced it's not one cause, it's multiple causes.
Okay.
14 causes have been identified as being possible. I believe it may be conceivable that over 12 of the 14 that have been suggested all play a role. And
so if you've got that many factors at play, you could almost argue this may have been designed or intended for that purpose.
Exactly.
If you will.
When you got that many that have to happen simultaneously at just the right levels, this looks like supernatural design is playing a role here, especially when we realize this is crucially what's needed for billions of people to be able to hear and respond to the gospel message.
So in order for Earth to be inhabitable with as many people as we have, we need something like these long interglacial cycles.
We do, and we need the stability.
Right.
We need
and
both.
Then to get the long interglacial, or the longer cycle, we need multiple factors at play to make it happen.
Correct.
Can you just, I don't want to go through all of them, but give a couple that are maybe the easier to understand, that what might impact the length of this?
Well, one thing we know for sure is that one of the big factors was a drop in the atmospheric carbon dioxide level.
Okay.
However, there's multiple ways that could have happened, and I'm convinced we need several factors to bring about that drop.
Okay. So you got a drop in carbon dioxide.
Right. Another thing is that there was a major asteroid or comet that hit the Earth 800,000 years ago, and this played a role in dropping the oxygen level.
So, okay, so you got the carbon dioxide dropping, you also have just the oxygen levels dropping. Is that what you're saying?
No, the oxygen level doesn't drop. It's a carbon dioxide level.
Carbon dioxide level that drops.
Carbon dioxide levels drop, but if you get an asteroid hitting the Earth, that's going to have a cooling effect.
Okay.
That cooling effect is going to cause more carbon dioxide to be absorbed in the ocean. The other thing is you get dust.
Okay.
And there's actually several models that have been proposed of different sources of dust that basically enrich the oceans with iron that cause the phytoplankton there to draw more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere.
So you increase the biological activity, that also impacts the carbon dioxide.
That will pull the carbon dioxide out.
Okay.
So
one more, I'm going to refer people to your blog, and they're going to be able to look at all of them. One more example of something that impacts this, or likely impacts the cycle.
Well, what's been happening in North America in the ice ages, because with each successive ice age, we get North America being covered with more ice and thicker ice.
Okay.
And we also noticed that with the last ice age, it built up quickly and receded quickly. And so one point is making, hey, the rapid deposition, especially the rapid disappearance of the ice. I mean, thousands of feet of ice disappear in less than 1,000 years.
That's pretty remarkable.
Pretty remarkable, and it's unique to the last ice age, and it goes back to the 800,000 years ago when this transition happened. So I think that plays a role, and also explains why every successive ice age has been a little more severe than the previous one. But the bottom line is, Jeff, this is really complicated. 14 factors have been suggested. I'm not even sure we've come up with a complete list.
Right.
There may be more there, because 2 of those 14 were discovered in just the last 6 months.
So, random question here, just kind of related though. How long do you think it will be before we go to the next ice age?
Well, that depends. I mean, we see in the previous ice ages, it looks like the melting of the polar ice cap is what kicked off the coming of the ice age. That's what's kind of paradoxical.
So you get warming to the polar ice caps melt, and that actually precipitates the ice age.
Global warming always brings on an ice age.
That's a little counterintuitive.
And if you look at the previous ice ages, whenever the temperature hit a peak, about 2 degrees centigrade above where it is now, a rapid drop into a long-lasting ice age.
All right.
And the thinking is the melting of the polar ice cap plays a role, because if you melt the polar ice cap, that causes a lot more snow to fall on Siberia and Canada.
Okay.
And that's what...
So you think we may not be too far off? So.
Well, it depends. I mean, we can preserve the polar ice cap. I think we got a chance to, stave it off for another 1,000 years or so.
You know, we tend to think of ice ages as a bad thing, kind of destructive to the planet. But really, it's an important aspect of how the earth is habitable for humanity. And it looks like God has orchestrated things so that that ice age cycle occurs in a way to allow humans to thrive, especially at this time and at this place. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org, search for Hugh's articles on this. And if you search for Pleistocene, that's Pleistocene, you'll get links to a number of articles where Hugh explains why these ice ages are important, how they point to a creator, and how you can use this evidence to go out and share the good news of the God of the Bible.
We hope you enjoyed this episode and that it helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And don't forget, subscribe to the show and search for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show.
If you want the podcast version, you can get us wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search Reasons to Believe Podcast on your provider. See y'all next week. Happy Earth Day.